Hi there. Well, we are now in compliance, which is Module 9. This is kind of towards the conclusion of our program, and we hope you've enjoyed the process of going through so many different topics over the course of the last number of months. Compliance is a tricky issue, which is why we have provided this to you as a quick lecturette so that when we do meet, we will have a chance to talk more about how this applies to you. But in this case, compliance is critical to any certification having to do with digital services. So let's take a look at all the different things, and there may be more. If it is, please let me know by all means. We have the Freedom of Information Act, better known as FOIA, e-discovery, which is relatively new, what must be kept, which is just the idea of records management, and how long, what is the proper procedure for disposal, CGIS, PCI compliance, HIPAA compliance, Paperwork Reduction Act, other issues having to do with privacy. And of course, there are some other things. So let's kind of begin, if we could, kind of a review of the ones that we have researched and believe impact what you do the most. The first is American with Disabilities Act, the ADA, Section 508 in particular. This is like many government initiatives. What starts out in one way winds up in something totally different. The ADA has truly expanded into ways that the original framers never had in mind, but the goal is still the same, and that is to protect all Americans, make sure that there are no physical barriers that would inhibit them from being full productive citizens and partaking in the services that governments can provide. So Section 508 continues to evolve, as we say, because it has a new web guidelines for government sites that took effect last year in January 2018. And in this case, they were looking for more accessibility, giving people with challenges more opportunities and putting the burden more on web managers. And we know this group essentially many of you have begun as web managers, and many still are. So it's really kind of a new burden, and a lot of people are waking up to the implications. So take a look at 508. I'm sure that you've updated. Now, some people will say, well, it only applies to the federal government. To some extent, that is true. But when it comes to federal law, I would not just assume that it's only for the federal funded projects. I think it does apply to local government as well. I think most lawyers would agree. But people often forget, and again, we're going back because not everybody has moved up the ranks through web management. But we get into things where we're talking about font acceptability, its size, screen contrast, content, in terms of what's available, how easy it is to navigate, sound considerations, having the option to bring the sound up to a higher level, language options, the ability to obtain help online, and again, this new focus on accessibility. This becomes even more tricky when we look at how all the pieces fit together. We have a mobile environment, we have a web environment, and all these things get integrated, from sensors to dial-up phones to mobile devices to tablets, and each one has its own characteristics. Now, responsive design certainly helps with a lot of that, but there are still apps out there that are totally independent, and it becomes quite a burden when you look at each one of these things. And as has been discussed in other little lecturettes, not everything that is done by a government agency is in control of you or any one person. And we've talked about policies, leadership, governance, and we understand the challenges involved with all of that. But when you think about it, if anybody could have their own apps, who are they accountable to, and how do you get things to look like is from the same jurisdiction, the same government? One great source that we always turn to is digitalgov.gov. They do have a checklist of requirements for federal websites and digital services. Many localities watch that very, very carefully. When we look at the landscape of what's going on with digital government today, you have acceptability compliance. We have the challenge of coming up with analytics to see how well one is doing. We have the the constant worry about, do we have the right content, and is the information of a nature of quality that can be measured. We have to be careful of copyright materials. There are people who think that all you have to do is, if you see something on Google, all you have to do is clip it and put it in and insert it, when in fact there are some very serious copyright restrictions that most people tend to ignore. But a government becomes an easy target for suit. Then we have to be concerned about customer service, digital service, which is kind of like the e-government behind this. We have to be concerned about domains and branding. And then there's the old Freedom of Information Act, which is gaining in popularity, not waning. We have governance, which is the policy. We have issues having to do with what links to whom. We have to take into account a mobile environment. We have multilingual websites, or at least a demand for that. We have open government, data content. Some are separate sites, some are integrated. We have the paperwork reduction acts that exist at the state level, in some cases, certainly at the federal level. We have performance measurement and reporting challenges. We have plain reporting, which is a government initiative started at the federal level to make reporting more generally readable and taking up less space. We know that governments left to their own make things very complicated, often because I think lawyers spend too much time on these documents and to make it very difficult to read. So now there are requirements to make things plain and easy and using quote-unquote less paper. We have to worry about privacy and identity management, that we are dealing with who we are told we are dealing with. We do have required content, let alone content that we would like to have showing on our various devices. And then the idea of comprehensive search. Add to that the burdens of security, dealing with technology standards, like where governments will be asked, for anybody with a .gov, and if you haven't heard this, you're hearing it now, that all government entities with a .gov will be required in a short amount of time to move over to HTTPS. So they are looking for secure sites. They will not list you unless you have that. And so this is coming out of the General Services Administration, or GSA. And then we have usability, user experience. We have ways to rate that. And then we have the user experience from the user themselves without us trying to guess what's going on. So the most obvious thing we worry about is compliance, having to do with Section 508 and records, and worrying about who decides. So let's turn to records management. That becomes a challenge unto itself. We could probably do an entire module just on that. But what are the main elements of records management and compliance? Well, these are the 7 that we've identified looking at the literature. We have, can we locate it? Now, in the federal government, they actually have contracted with a number of organizations where there is hard copies in mines, old abandoned mines, where workers are literally dropped down on one of these little trams, and they store papers, and they're processing information because they find that the atmosphere in the mines can be better maintained and controlled. So who knew? We have the storage, not just location, but where they're stored, how they can be retrieved, what are the proper ways in which one can dispose of stuff, and what time frame. And it's not a blanket statement. Certain records have to be kept forever, and some records can be released after 5 years, some after 7 years. We have the issue of privacy, making sure that they do not reach the wrong hands. And then we have access. Different from privacy in the sense that who has access to this record? Is it a look-see kind of arrangement, or are they able to download a copy? And what restrictions are they under if that is granted? And then this whole idea of protection of records. They are not destroyed if they are supposed to be kept. And that also includes, of all these things, indexing. So one might ask, okay, what's changed in all of this? Well, the explosion of electronic information, for one. Legal issues, the legal profession has somewhat caught up, but not fully. And understanding all the nuances based on all this new technology. We have new policy challenges and issues brought about by an educated public. We have social changes in which everybody's used to getting everything online, on demand, at any time. The whole idea of email as opposed to just paper letters, and the speed and volume of this information. And if for those of you who have YouTube channels, I'm always amazed by the growing statistics that indicate that somewhere between 3 and 400 hours of video information is uploaded to YouTube every single minute of the day on average. That's an amazing number. 3 to 400 hours every minute. Then we have text messaging, which is quite prevalent. We also have photo messaging, which is part of text messaging. We have Web 2.0, which is the ability where for the first time people, citizens, residents can actually help create content, not just be a consumer of it. Photo sharing actually outpaces some of the text messaging that we were used to years ago. We have the decentralization of files and information that still needs to be understood. And then we have new collaboration tools. So every state is different, so we can't go too much depth in records management because of the fact that not everybody follows the federal rules that are set forth by the archives. The archives in D.C., Washington, are the ones responsible for federal document policy and retention. They go by the U.S. Code. Many states have their own. And if you haven't done so, you may want to look up your state's record management policy. They have their own requirements, but more often than not, they go by the U.S. Archives. So something to think about. Every state is different, but these issues that we've discussed in terms of the main elements of record keeping and management is pretty universal. They're just defined in somewhat different terms, and of course there are penalties. Then we have e-discovery, which is very closely related to records management. You know, for the longest time, before computers took hold in an office setting, it was not uncommon for lawyers to request from the other party, whichever side you began on, and what the question would be is, give us all the information and memorandums for the last 3 years. And it was usually used not just to find information, discover something prior to a trial, to either defend somebody or prosecute somebody, but it was also used very often as a nuisance, so that people would be so intimidated by these requests that they would be inclined to settle, they'd have to comply with all this stuff. It was totally time consuming. It took a new generation of lawyers to come in and say, wait a minute, we're collecting all these boxes and files of information, but we should be able to do the same thing electronically with all the records having to do with emails and text messages. And so this became an amazing headache for those running the technical enterprise of any local government. About 15 years ago, that was the number one concern of CIOs because it just exploded in front of them when suddenly somebody in the city or county manager's office would come to them and say, I need the last 10 years of this employee's information, and this was required under court order. So e-discovery has become very, very time consuming. There's a lot to it. There's a video in your homework assignment and I'll give you the link for it. I'm not going to play any of the videos here or now because it just doesn't work as well. But you'll have the opportunity to listen to it and look at it. But e-discovery can be very time consuming. The good news is there's a lot of solution providers that provide automated ways in which information can be stored and retrieved legally. Many great companies that we are aware of that can actually do the search and help you figure out how to find and index information without sucking up all the time that it can take, because that can be totally labor intensive. It's well worth looking at if you don't have that. Then we have the Freedom of Information Act, which has been around for a long time. I've talked to some of the people recently, and they're all excited. They have a new website, too. So the Freedom of Information, which is FOIA.gov, is full of information. You can learn about FOIA. You can explore FOIA data. They have report formats you can find, you can learn. It is a very useful website. And a lot of people, when asked, what department does this fall under, people are surprised to learn that FOIA, Freedom of Information Request, is administered by the United States Department of Justice. So, direct link. But the penalties for failure to comply are pretty severe. And so governments take this seriously. Initially, this was the federal government only. Now, most states are also dealing with freedom of information requests. It has become far more popular than ever before. And now at the FOIA.gov site, they are actually tracking. They can tell you which departments are doing a better job than others. They can tell you how long it might take for you to get information. And clearly, some of the issues that people want more information on often have a security risk issue associated with it, which sometimes takes much longer. It has to go through a much more laborious review process, often redacting many sentences, if not pages of information. So the FOIA portal definitely promises a more streamlined way. So one might ask, what are these challenges? Well, the challenges today, since in the old days people would carry more than one device, a personal device that was theirs and a government device. In some cases, people are going back to that. But you have to discern what is official and what is personal. And to this day, that still becomes a problem. The freedom of information requests continue to increase because it is so easy to fill out a request online. And there are many services. It's talked about in colleges and universities. Local governments have spaces on their sites that talk about how to do it. So certainly it's been better promoted, and people are using this more and more. But it does raise questions, how long must files be kept? But in today's world, akin to record management, we're dealing with digital preservation, video preservation, print documents, and that raises some interesting challenges because as we move into high definition and super high definition, what once used to be where space was cheap, it is now becoming very expensive because video files take up a tremendous amount of space compared to just text. So it raises questions about where does e-discovery fit into this versus the whole idea of FOIA. There is some overlap. What rules and regulations must we be aware of? And that varies from locality to state. We know the feds, and that information is readily available at FOIA.gov and other sites that I've already highlighted. We also introduced the concept of electronic signatures. Question, do you accept electronic signatures? Because that's what people are expecting. Whether they're using Adobe or DocuSign, this is becoming more popular, especially when we're expecting people to sign online. What provisions do you have for electronic signatures? What are the barriers if you're not able to offer it now? What might be the advantages if you were to decide to do that? Our next area is going to be PCI or DSS compliance. Now, many localities take credit cards. Where it comes to play with digital services is when those credit cards interact with citizens and a website or even an app. PCI stands for Payment Card Industry. The DSS is Data Security Standard. There's now even a higher version of this. And the regulations are very strict, and there are many local governments that cannot comply with PCI. They've got to turn to a third party. Often it is a bank or other financial provider, perhaps PayPal. So if you take credit cards, compliance is required. And what TrustGuard says is that 84% websites are vulnerable to hackers or other attacks. Is your website getting scanned for vulnerabilities? So you have a tremendous risk in terms of public trust, financial loss, business interruption, and lawsuits. And so I have a video here that talks about PCI compliance. It's very basic. And again, in your written assignment, we will highlight this for you. Additional challenges down the road are going to have to do with money collection. Accepting credit cards made online transactions possible. But now we're getting into Apple Pay, Google Wallet, and to some extent, cyber currency like Bitcoin and other mediums. So we're going to see more of this. We're going to see more governments taking advantage of this. And so it is really a brave new age when we think about all the different things that we have to worry about. And we're just halfway through. So I believe in keeping these lecturettes a little short. We're going to take a quick break, and then you'll be able to carry on with part 2.